I'll tell you what I saw, because I was the nearest neighbor Nora Finn had on those breaks, and nearness on the Nebraska grass in 1878 meant 4 miles of ridge and cutbank between our two claims. Near enough to matter. Far enough that a woman could go under before you knew it. I am Eb Sutter. I ran a small cow-calf operation on the south end of the Redgrass Breaks, had done since '71, and I knew the Finn claim the way you know a place you have ridden past 1,000 times and worried about twice that many. Roy Finn had taken that ground in '74, 160 acres of hard grass flat with a reliable spring in a hollow below the house, which was the only reason Roy had wanted it, and the only reason it was worth fighting for after Roy was gone. He died in the spring of '77, a week before the thaw finished, of a chest sickness that had been working on him since the previous November. He left Nora a half-built barn, a team of draft horses named Clement and Wick, a milk cow called June, $112 in a coffee tin, and that spring in the hollow. That was the whole estate. Nora did not sell. I expected her to. Most women would have, and no one would have blamed her. She was 43 years old, no children, no family within 3 states, and the claim was as raw as the day Roy had filed on it. But Nora Finn had been running that place alongside Roy for 3 years, and her arithmetic was clear. The spring was worth more than the money, the ground was worth more than the grief, and she was not finished yet. So she stayed. I helped her when she let me, which was not as often as I would have liked. She was not a proud woman in the brittle way that refuses everything offered. She was proud in the solid way that makes a person do their own work first and call for help only when the work is genuinely past them. She finished the barn herself through that summer with lumber she hauled from Kendrick in 3 trips. She put up hay in August with a borrowed rake. She kept her cow and her team through the winter on cut and dried grass, and a little grain she bought on credit from the Kendrick Mercantile. In the spring of '78 she planted a kitchen garden and broke 2 more acres of sod. By autumn of '78 she owed the Mercantile $41, and she had 2 beef cattle she was planning to sell to cover it. And the water right on the spring was still in Roy's name, because the filing had never been transferred correctly, and Meridian Land Company had noticed. I did not know about the Meridian filing when the stranger rode in. I found out later, the way you find out about most of the trouble in a woman like Nora's life. After the fact, from her, in plain language, as though she were reporting a fence post that needed replacing rather than a mortal threat to everything she owned. At the time, in the last week of October 1878, I knew only what I could see. The autumn had been thin and cold, the hay was short, and Nora Finn was going to have a hard winter. The stranger came in on a Thursday evening, as near as I can place it. I was not there. I know what happened because Nora told me, piece by piece, over the months that followed, in the way she told me most things, a sentence here, a sentence there, each one exact and without decoration. She was not a woman who told a story for the pleasure of the telling. She told it when it was useful to tell it, and she told it straight. His name was Cass Holden, though Nora did not know that for the first 20 minutes. What she knew was that a man on a limping gray horse came up the track to her door at dusk in a hard northwest wind, and that the horse was in bad shape and the man was not much better. He was somewhere in his 50s, she thought, weathered in the face, heavy through the shoulders, wearing a good coat that had been rained on and frozen, and was doing him about half the service it had been built to do. He had a bedroll and a pair of saddlebags and a rifle in the scabbard, and the look of a man who had been riding since before the weather turned, and had not caught up with shelter since. She opened the door before he knocked. She had seen him from the kitchen window when he was still 200 yards out, coming along the ridge in that wind, and she had put the coffee on. "Horse is lame," she said, when he stepped up to the porch. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Left front. I've been walking him since the creek crossing 3 miles back." "Put him in the barn," she said. "There's a stall on the left. Hay's in the loft, not much of it. Come in when you've seen to him." She told me she did not think long about whether to let him in. It was a cold evening and he was a cold man, and there was no calculus there that produced a different answer. The breaks were not a lawless country, not in '78, the worst of the earlier years was mostly past, and a man on a limping horse at dusk in a northwest wind was, in her experience, a man who needed a barn and a fire and something to eat, not a man to be suspicious of. She was not naive. She was practical. He came in after 20 minutes, having rubbed the horse down and given it hay and water and wrapped the leg in a strip of burlap he'd found in the stall. He was a careful man with animals, she noted. He had taken his coat off and hung it on the porch rail to dry and come in his shirt and vest, and he stood just inside the door and said, "I thank you for the shelter, ma'am. I'm Cass Holden. I can pay for the stall." "Sit down," she said. "I'll hear about payment in the morning. Are you hungry?" He said he was. What she had in the house that evening was the coffee, a pot of salt pork and dried beans that had been on the back of the stove since noon, 4 eggs, and 1 loaf of bread she had baked that morning. The bread was all the flour she had left. She had planned it to last her 3 days. She put the salt pork and beans on the table, fried 2 of the eggs, and cut the loaf in half and set it down beside them. She poured him coffee and sat across from him and ate her half of what was there, and let him have the rest. He ate carefully and without hurry. He did not ask about her situation or her husband or how long she had been alone on the claim, which was the first 3 things most men asked, in Nora's telling. He said the coffee was good. He said the beans were well seasoned. He asked if the spring in the hollow froze over in January, and she said the top froze, but you could break through to running water underneath. And he nodded as if he had been asking for a practical reason and not to make conversation, which, she thought later, he probably had been. After supper, he asked again about payment for the stall. She told him 2 bits would cover it. He put 4 bits on the table and said the extra was for the meal, and she left it there, because arguing about it seemed like more trouble than it was worth. She gave him a blanket and he slept on the floor near the stove, and in the morning the wind had dropped and he saddled the gray, still limping, but better for the rest, and rode out south before she had finished her own breakfast. She heard the horse on the track and looked out the window, and he was already past the hollow and moving at a slow walk on the ridge. She finished her coffee and washed up the dishes and did not think about it again, or told me she didn't, which may have been the same thing or may not. I rode over the following week. It was the first week of November, and I had a side of beef I wanted to split with her, a steer I had butchered and had more of than I needed. She took half of it without a great deal of argument, which told me the pantry was leaner than she wanted me to know. She made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table, and I asked how the autumn had gone, and she said it had gone. I told her the hay situation on my end, and she told me hers, which was about a third short of what she needed to carry her team through to April. We talked through the numbers. It was not comfortable. "You hear anything from Meridian?" I asked, because I had heard from the postmaster in Kendrick that Meridian Land Company had been sending letters to addresses along the breaks, and Nora's name had come up. She was quiet for a moment. "Had a letter," she said, 2 weeks back. "About the water right." "About the water right." She folded her hands on the table. "Roy filed on the spring in '74 as Roy Fenn, head of household. When he died, I didn't think to refile. Should have. Meridian's got a man who looks for those gaps. They say the right reverts to open claim if the original holder is deceased and no transfer has been recorded." I sat with that. It was not impossible. The water law in Nebraska territory in those years was a patchwork, and Meridian Land Company employed lawyers who were better at reading the patchwork than most homesteaders were. "That spring is the whole claim," I said. "I know what the spring is, Eb. What are you going to do?" "I need to find out if they're right about the filing," she said. "And if they are, I need to file a transfer before they file a claim. Which means I need to get to the land office in Garfield by the 1st of December. Which means I need $40 for the lawyer there who knows the filing system, because I cannot do it alone. which means I need to sell the beef cattle in Kendrick, which I was planning to do anyway. Except the Kendrick buyers are paying 6 cents a pound this year, and my 2 steers will bring me about $32. And $32 is not 40. She said all of this in the same even tone she used to report the weather. I offered to lend her the $8. She thanked me and said she would think about it. I knew what that meant. She would not take it unless there was no other path, and she had not yet run out of paths. I went home and worried about her through November. It was a cold month, early hard frost, and the hay situation on the breaks was bad for everyone. I was feeding heavier than I had planned, and I knew Nora was too. I rode over twice more and brought a load of cut corn fodder the second time, which she accepted on the grounds that I had more than I needed, which was approximately true. On the third visit, the first week of December, she told me what had happened. Cass Holden had come back. He had ridden in on a different horse, a stout brown gelding, not limping, on a Wednesday evening in the middle of November. She had been in the barn when she heard him on the track. She came out and saw him and recognized him before he was off the horse. "Mr. Holden," she said. "Mrs. Fenn," he said. He had remembered her name from the letter on the kitchen shelf, she supposed, or from the signpost at the track's fork, which Roy had put up in '75 and she had repainted in the spring. "I was passing through the breaks on business. I wanted to return this." He reached into his coat and produced her bread pan. She had not noticed it was missing. He had taken it that morning in October when he left. She realized, taken it to give himself a reason to come back, or taken it by accident and carried it 300 miles until he found himself passing through again. She did not know which and did not ask. She took the bread pan. "Business in the breaks," she said. "Land business," he said. "I work for a Colorado syndicate. We're looking at grazing ground in this section. I spent the last 2 weeks riding the breaks from Kendrick west." He paused. "I've been asking around Kendrick as well, asking about water." She looked at him. "The fellow at the land office mentions Meridian Land Company has been active along here," he said. "Particular interest in a spring on a claim belonging to a widow named Fenn." She was quiet for a moment. "You've been asking about me." "I asked about the water," he said. "You happen to be attached to it." They stood there in the cold for a moment, and then she said, "Come in out of the wind, then." He came in. She had beef now, one of her 2 steers, butchered early because the feed was short, and she made a proper supper, a thing she had not done for company since Roy died. They sat at the table and he ate, and she told him about the Meridian filing without being asked, which surprised her in the telling of it. She was not a woman who explained her difficulties to people she barely knew, but Cass Holden had the quality of listening in a way that made information seem like a practical exchange rather than a confession. He listened to all of it. He asked 2 or 3 questions, precise ones, about the date of Roy's death and the date of the original filing, and what the Meridian letter had said specifically. Then he was quiet for a while. "The Garfield Land Office," he said. "What's the name of the lawyer there who knows the filing system?" She told him. "I know that office," he said. "I've filed 6 or 7 transfers through them for the syndicate this year. I know the clerk as well as the lawyer." He set his coffee cup down. "If you'll let me, I can ride to Garfield and sort this out for you. The syndicate has an account with that office. I can advance the filing fee and you can pay me back when the steers sell." She looked at him for a long time. "Why?" she said. He did not look away. "You fed me the last of your bread when you didn't know me from Adam," he said. "You fed me and asked nothing for it, and you gave me a warm barn for my horse. I am in a position to return that, and I am going to." She said she thought about arguing with him. She said the argument she had ready was the same one she always had ready, that she did not need it, that she could manage, that his debt was paid with the 4 bits he'd left on the table. She looked at him and the argument did not come out. He was not asking her permission to be generous. He was telling her plainly what he intended to do. "All right," she said. He rode to Garfield the following day and spent 3 days there. He came back to the Fenn claim on the fourth day with the transfer filing completed, the water right re-recorded in the name of Nora Fenn, sole holder, and a copy of the filing that made the Meridian claim null and void before it could be formally submitted. He also came back with a letter from the Colorado Syndicate's Kendrick agent offering to buy her 2 remaining steers at 9 cents a pound, because the syndicate was paying a better rate than the local buyers, and Holden had mentioned the Fenn claims beef on the ride through. She paid him back the filing fee out of the steer money. She had enough left over to clear the mercantile debt and have $30 remaining for the spring, which was more than she had started the autumn with. He did not leave immediately. That was the part Nora told me last, and she told it the way she told the most important things, briefly, without emphasis, as though it were a minor detail in a longer account. "He's still there," she said. I had ridden over in the first week of December, and we were sitting at the kitchen table, same as always, and she said it while she was pouring the second coffee, as though it were an afterthought. I looked at her, still on the claim. "He's got a line camp about a mile east on the syndicate's leased ground," she said. "He checks in most evenings." I thought about that. "Most evenings," I said. "Most evenings," she said, and went to the window and looked out at nothing in particular. I did not push. Nora Fenn was a woman who said things when she was ready to say them, and not before. I met Cass Holden the following week. She had asked me to ride over for a reason. She wanted me to look at Clement's left rear shoe, which had been throwing the horse off, and when I arrived, Holden was in the barn already, Clement's hoof between his knees, examining the problem with the focused attention of a man who had shot a great many horses. He looked up when I came in. He had a straight, direct look that was neither unfriendly nor eager. He put Clement's hoof down and straightened up and said, "Eb Sutter, Nora's mentioned you." "Cass Holden," I said, "she's mentioned you too." We shook hands. He was a big man, broader than he looked at first, with the kind of economy of movement that comes from years of physical work. His hands were calloused in the specific way of a man who has swung rope and handled livestock all his life. His face had the quality of a country that has had hard weather for a long time. The lines were deep, but they were not bitter lines. There was something in the eyes that reminded me of men I had known who had lost someone and had kept moving anyway. We worked on the shoe together. He was good with the horse, and the horse was easy with him, which told me something. Animals are not diplomatic. After we were done and Clement was back in the stall, Holden and I stood in the barn door for a minute and looked out at the breaks in the December light, which was thin and gray and beautiful in the way of that country when it is cold. "What's the syndicate doing in this section?" I asked him. It was a reasonable question, and I meant it as one. "Looking at grazing leases," he said. 12,000 acres along the breaks if we can put the parcels together, probably 6 months of work." He was quiet for a moment. "I've filed for a 6-month extension on my assignment." 6 months. I looked at him sideways. He was looking at the breaks. "Long time to be in line camp," I said. "It is," he said. He turned and walked back to the house, because Nora had called from the porch that the coffee was ready. I followed him, and I watched how he walked toward her voice, not in a hurry, but with a directness, like a man moving toward the thing he has decided is worth moving toward. She was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed against the cold, and she watched him come up the porch steps, and I saw what happened in her face, which was almost nothing, a slight settling, a quiet release of something held. With Nora, that was a very great deal. We had coffee. Holden and I talked about the grazing land, about water rights in the section, about the price of beef going into 1879. He knew the cattle business from the inside out, prices, routes, the syndicate work, the economics of the breaks versus the river bottom land further east. He spoke plainly and listened carefully and did not say things he wasn't sure of, which was rarer than it should have been. When I left that evening, riding back south in the dark, I thought about what I was seeing, and I thought about what I knew of Nora Finn, which was considerable, and I thought about what I knew of men like Cass Holden, which was enough. He was a man who had been moving for a long time. You could see it in the way he occupied a space, fully present, fully settled, as though he had decided this particular space was worth being in, but also with the faint quality of a man who knew how to pack and ride when the time came. The saddlebags he had carried in October were still in the barn. Not in the line camp. In the barn at Nora's claim, on the same peg where she'd told him to hang them when he first arrived. I had noticed that when we were working on Clement's shoe. A man does not leave his gear at a woman's barn by accident. January came in hard. The brakes froze down to their bones, the creek crossing solid, the hollow spring crusted over, the wind out of the northwest for 10 days without relief. It was a killing cold for cattle and horses both, and every rancher in that section was feeding heavy and sleeping light. Holden moved out of the line camp during the worst of it and slept in Nora's barn. She told me this without particular emphasis, as though it were a purely practical arrangement, which in part it was. The line camp was a plank shack with a single inadequate stove, and the barn at the Finn claim was well built and banked with hay on the north side. He slept in the barn and came in for meals, and they got through the worst of the cold together. I rode over twice in January. The first time, Holden was out on the lease land checking on the syndicate's wintered cattle, and Nora and I sat alone at the table and drank coffee and talked about the hay situation, which was as short as it had been in November but no longer desperate, because Holden had arranged in December for a load of hay from a seller in Kendrick on the syndicate's account, which he was carrying himself as a loan to be repaid in the spring. She told me this in the matter-of-fact way she told me everything, but she watched me when she said it, measuring my reaction. "He's a careful man," I said, because that was what I had concluded. "Yes," she said. "And a persistent one." She smiled a little. Not much. Nora Finn did not smile extravagantly, but enough. "He is that," she said. The second visit I met him again, and we sat around her table for the better part of an evening, talking and drinking coffee, and by the end of it I understood what he was doing as clearly as if he had said it plainly. He was making himself necessary. Not in the manipulative way, not in the way of a man who manufactures need so he can be the one to fill it, in the way of a man who sees what is required and does it, consistently, without drama, because he has decided that this place and this woman are worth the doing. The filing, the hay, the shoe on Clement's hoof, the evening spent talking through the numbers of the spring, the morning spent fixing the north wall of the barn where the planking had pulled loose. All of it was deliberate. All of it was honest. He was not concealing his intentions exactly. He was simply pursuing them with patience and with work, which was the only way Nora Finn would have received them. I had known men who courted women the way they broke horses, with noise and pressure and a kind of aggressive tenderness that was more about the man's need than the woman's. Holden was not like that. He courted her the way he had ridden to Garfield. He assessed what was needed, he did the work, and he came back with the thing accomplished. He let her see it for what it was, and he let her decide. It was February when she told me she had figured it out. I had ridden over on a clear, cold afternoon. The worst of winter was still on the ground, but the light was beginning to change the way it does in February in that country. A slight extension of the afternoon that you notice mostly because it surprises you. She was in the kitchen when I came in and Holden was out feeding, and we had a few minutes alone the way we occasionally did. "He asked me what I thought about the spring," she said, standing at the stove. "The water. The season," she said, "what I thought the breaks would look like in the spring, what I was planning. He wanted to know if I was staying." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was staying." She was quiet for a moment. "He said he thought the breaks might be worth staying in." I sat with that. Outside, I could hear Holden's voice, low and steady, talking to Clement and Wick the way men talk to horses in cold weather. "What do you think he means by that?" I asked, though I knew perfectly well what he meant by it. "I know what he means," she said. She did not say it with warmth exactly. Nora Finn did not deal in warmth as a primary currency, but there was something in her voice that I had not heard since Roy was alive. A settled quality, a permission given to herself. She turned from the stove and looked at me directly. "I am 52 years old next month, Eb. I have been alone on this claim for 2 years. I am not a woman who has a great deal of patience for indirection, in myself or in other people." "No," I said, "you are not." "I think I am going to tell him that I understand what he is doing," she said, "and that he can do it plainly if he likes." I laughed. I could not help it. It was the most Nora Finn sentence I had ever heard her say. She looked at me with the mild severity she used when she found something funny, but did not think she should. "It's not comic, Eb." "No," I said, "it isn't. It's a fine thing to say." She turned back to the stove. "It may be," she said. "We'll see." The weeks that followed were the kind I would not have known about if Nora had not been the sort of woman who, once she had decided to tell a thing, told it plainly. She did not narrate sentiment. She reported events, but even in the reporting I understood what those weeks were. She told him, not in those exact words, not in a formal speech. She said it in pieces over 2 or 3 evenings, the way you build a fence line when you don't have enough posts for the whole run. You put in what you have and come back for the rest. She said she appreciated what he had done for the claim. She said she knew what he was doing when he did it, the filing and the hay and the rest of it, and she did not want him to think she didn't see it clearly. She said she was not a woman who received things without knowing the price of them, and she wanted to be clear about what she understood. He listened to all of this in the same way he listened to everything, completely, without interruption, without rushing to fill the silences. When she had finished, he said, "I know you see it clearly. I wasn't trying to obscure it." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been writing a long time. I don't have family that amounts to a thing. I have the work and the syndicate and a horse and a line camp, and that was enough until it wasn't. I rode in here in October on a lame horse in the cold, and you opened your door and gave me the last of what you had, and I rode away knowing I was going to come back. That's the whole of it." She told me she looked at him for a long time after that. "You came back for the bread pan," she said. "I came back for the bread pan," he agreed. There was something in his face that was almost a smile. "And for you." "That's plain enough," she said. "Yes," he said, "I thought it might be." It was a courtship that looked, from the outside, like 2 people working a claim together and occasionally saying an important thing, which is perhaps the most honest kind. He mended the barn siding, and she mended the fence line west of the hollow. He tallied the syndicate's lease inventory, and she tallied the spring planting schedule, and they spread both sets of figures on the kitchen table and talked them through together, because their numbers had begun to be adjacent to each other in a way that made it efficient to discuss them in the same room. He ate supper at the house most evenings, and she cooked more than she had cooked when she was alone, not because she wanted to impress him. Nora Finn did not cook to impress, but because cooking for 2 was proportionally more satisfying than cooking for 1, and she was a practical woman. I noticed things. I noticed that the north wall of the barn was not only replanked, but banked properly with cut sod for the first time. I noticed that the track up from the hollow fork had been graded, and the worst of the ruts filled. I noticed that Clement and Wick had been reshod in February instead of waiting until spring, and that there were new hinges on the house door, and the larder shelves had been reinforced. None of these were large things. All of them together were a considerable thing. A man who fixes the hinges on a door is a man who has decided he will be going through it for some time. In March, the thaw began. The breaks came back color by color, brown first, then the pale winter-wheat yellow of the dried grass catching light, then the first faint wash of green in the lower places where the snowmelt collected. The spring in the hollow ran clean and full, legally and permanently in Nora Finn's name, and the 2 steers she had sold in the fall had cleared her mercantile debt, and the $30 she had carried through the winter had become $45 with the small sale of butter and eggs she had managed through February, and the hay loan from the syndicate was cleared. Her books were in order for the first time since Roy had gotten sick. Holden's 6-month extension on his assignment was nearly done. The syndicate had completed its grazing lease arrangements along the breaks in early March, and there was talk of a new assignment in Wyoming territory that wanted his attention. He had said nothing about it to Nora, but she had seen the letter from the syndicate's Denver office on the line camp table when she brought him a meal during a stretch when the cold came back in February. She told me she did not ask him about it. She waited. He came in one morning in the last week of March, a clear morning after a light snow had dusted the breaks overnight, and the sky was the particular blue that sky is in that country after a late snow, deep and clean, without a cloud in it. He came in from feeding and poured himself coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the hollow, where the spring was running through a skin of ice, and the willows along it were beginning to show the faint reddish tinge that meant sap rising. "Wyoming assignment starts in May," he said. Nora was at the table. She waited. He turned from the window. "I sent a letter to Denver this morning," he said. "I told them I was declining the Wyoming work." She looked at him. "I told them I had found a better situation," he said. "Which is the truth?" She was quiet for a long moment. "What situation is that?" she said. "A water right on the Redgrass breaks," he said, "in good legal order, held by a woman I would like to remain adjacent to for the foreseeable future." She looked at him. He did not look away. "Foreseeable future is a syndicate man's term," she said. "What does it mean in plain language?" He set his coffee down and crossed the kitchen and sat across the table from her, the way he had sat that first night in October, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her then, straight on, without performance or pressure. "It means I am asking you to marry me," he said, "if you are willing." Nora Fenn folded her hands on the table. She did not answer immediately, not because she was undecided, I think, but because she was the kind of woman who said things with intention, and intention requires a moment. "I am willing," she said, "on the condition that we are clear about the terms." "Name them," he said. "The claim is mine," she said. "It remains in my name, and I remain the one who decides what happens to it. Any arrangement we make as to the land is an arrangement we make together, and if you find you want a different arrangement, you can say so plainly, and we will talk about it plainly. I am not a woman who finds out important things after the fact." "I understand," he said. "The syndicate work," she said. "If you continue to do some of it nearby, I have no objection. If it takes you to Wyoming or Colorado for months at a time, I have a number of objections, and we should discuss them before they become relevant." "I intend to negotiate a local arrangement," he said. "The Colorado syndicate has a standing interest in the breaks. There is enough work in this section to occupy a man for several years." A pause. "And I am not interested in being far from here." She looked at him for a moment. "And the bread pan," she said. He blinked. Then something happened in his face, something loosened, a long-held thing releasing. It was the closest I ever heard he came to laughing from her account. "I will return the bread pan," he said, "at regular intervals for the rest of my life." "That is an adequate term," she said. They were married in Kendrick in the second week of April, a Saturday morning, with the judge and the judge's clerk as witnesses and myself and my wife Clara, who had come to meet Nora properly, and had decided within an hour of meeting her that she was one of the finest women in that section of Nebraska, which was my opinion as well. It was a plain service. Nora Fenn was not a woman for ceremony, and Holden stood through it with the quiet attention of a man who knows he is in the right place and does not need to announce it. Afterward we went back to the Fenn claim. The Holden claim now, though Nora kept Fenn in the name because it was the name on the water right, and the filing, and she saw no reason to complicate the legal situation. And Clara and Nora made a dinner in Holden, and I sat on the porch in the April sun, and drank the one bottle of good whiskey I had brought for the occasion. He was quiet for a while. Comfortable quiet, not the quiet of a man who has nothing to say, but the quiet of a man who is where he intended to be and finds the being there sufficient. "The gray horse," I said. "The one that was limping, what became of him?" He looked out at the hollow. "I sold him in Kendrick last October," he said, "before I went to Garfield for the filing. Found him a home with a boy who didn't need speed, just steadiness." A pause. "Good horse when he was right, just finished." "You miss him?" "I do," he said, "but I found a better situation." He looked at the door, where we could hear the women talking, Nora's voice and Clara's, back and forth in the kitchen over the sound of the meal being made. A considerably better one. From inside, through the open window, Nora said something to Clara that made Clara laugh. A real laugh, the surprised kind, which meant Nora had said something dry and exact, the way she did when she was comfortable. Holden smiled, "Not much." "Enough." I thought about that October night, which I had not witnessed but had come to know as well as things I'd seen myself. A cold man on a lame horse at dusk, and a woman who opened her door and gave him the last of what she had without knowing a thing about him. I thought about the bread pan on the porch rail of a line camp in Wyoming, or Colorado, or wherever he had been carrying it, making its way back across 300 miles in a saddlebag. I thought about what a person does when someone has been genuinely kind to them in a world that does not require it, and what that kindness is worth, and how far a good man will ride to return it. A loaf of bread, mostly. A barn on a cold night. The door opened without calculation, in the time it takes a woman to see a cold man on a ridge and put the coffee on. That was how it started. I saw how it ended, in the April light on that porch, Cass Holden sitting easy in the chair he had built himself from timber he'd hauled from Kendrick, the spring running clear in the hollow below the house, the breaks coming green in the afternoon sun, and from inside the sound of Nora's voice, exact and plain and warm, telling Clara something true. She had kept that claim alone for 2 years and would have kept it longer if she'd had to, and the keeping of it was all hers. But the spring in the hollow ran full, and the books were clean, and the door was not barred. A man had ridden in on a cold evening, and she had fed him. He had not forgotten. That was the whole of it, and it was enough.